James Harden is a member of the Philadelphia 76ers, and after all these months, Ben Simmons finally got traded. The deal is the Nets getting Ben Simmons, Seth Curry, Andre Drummond, and 2 first-round picks in exchange for James Harden and Paul Millsap. I'm going to talk about the trade itself, what happens next for each of these teams, but I want to take 1 minute to talk about how this all ended up happening. Because if you had told me a week ago that the Nets and Sixers were going to come up with this Simmons-Harden trade, I really wouldn't have believed it was going to happen. But over the last 24 to 36 hours, it became much more likely. We got a lot more reporting about James Harden's unhappiness in Brooklyn. But the problem was it was coming from all these different sources, none of which were Woj. But then this morning we get the story from Woj saying that James Harden does want to leave Brooklyn. He just hasn't told them that, and he really wants to end up in Philadelphia. And at that moment, once that news broke, I felt like this trade was 100% going to happen. There was too much risk involved for Brooklyn in potentially losing James Harden. Even if it's just in a sign and trade, they would have gotten less in the offseason than they got now. And so it makes sense we got here, but it's crazy that it ended up happening. Okay, let's talk about the trade. I want to begin from Philly's side because it's obviously much less complicated for them, and then we'll get to breaking down all the Brooklyn stuff. So for Philadelphia, the entire time, even from their head coach Doc Rivers, they've just needed another guard. They needed a playmaker. They needed a creator on the level of someone similar to James Harden, and that's always what they were trying to get out of Ben Simmons, whether it be Bradley Beal, Damian Lillard, or obviously James Harden. And immediately the combination of Harden and Embiid on the floor together, despite the fact that they did give up some other pieces, makes them such a better basketball team today than they were yesterday, because you're replacing Simmons, who's not even playing, with someone on the level of James Harden, who, in my opinion, is no longer a top-tier All-NBA caliber player, but he's still an all-star. He's still an elite perimeter creator and someone that should be an awesome combination with Joel Embiid. And I have to give Daryl Morey credit. There are times where I criticized him for waiting this long to move Ben Simmons and trying to get all these crazy offers from these other teams, but it's clear based off this trade package that James Harden was always near the top of his list to get in exchange for Simmons, and he did well to wait this long and get Harden in exchange, and hopefully they get a motivated, a healthy, and active and engaged James Harden for the rest of this year, and then they have to deal with the free agency aspect in the offseason as well. We're going to circle back to Philly later, but I want to talk about Brooklyn now. The more this story went on and the closer we got to the deadline, the more confident I was that this trade was going to happen, and quite frankly, the more excited I got about the possibility of making this move. Because the more that I thought about it, the more I realized that if Harden's not committed, if he doesn't want to be here, it's going to be really tough to go through the rest of the season and contend for a title with a guy that's as integral to the team as Harden is, and him not really being committed to the group. I didn't have an issue with the roster construction of those 3 guys together. We've seen them be incredibly successful. It just depends on if Harden was active and engaged in trying to win a title with this team, and it didn't feel like he was there anymore over the last couple of days. And with that being the case, the possibility of getting someone like Ben Simmons in addition to other pieces in exchange for him was really exciting. I had thought for the last maybe 2 days that it was going to be Harden in exchange for Simmons, Curry, and Matisse Thybulle, but the package they got is pretty decent. And it's a weird comparison because you're comparing what the Nets just got for Harden to what they traded for him to Houston, but obviously the values are different, and I think this is a really good package for what this team needs. Because if we're operating under the assumption that at some point Kyrie Irving is going to be a full-time player for the Nets and he gets to play in home games, they don't really need the perimeter creation that James Harden provides as much as they need the defense, the rebounding, the versatility of someone like Ben Simmons. Simmons isn't the only part of the package. We're going to get to that stuff later, but primarily we need to talk about what he adds to this team. As a defender, if he's active, if he's engaged, if he's okay with this new role in Brooklyn where he's going to be someone that could be the small ball 5 at the end of games, he's obviously going to have some perimeter creation responsibilities, especially in transition, but they need him to be an elite rebounder. They need him to be an elite defender, and they can deal with his floor spacing issues much better than Philly ever was able to. And if he can grow into that role with Brooklyn, it's a much better fit than whatever James Harden was giving them. The plan before for Brooklyn was, we're going to be the best offensive team of all time. We're going to outscore everybody. And it worked when those 3 guys were together. But given the way they match up with some of these other teams in the playoffs potentially, Simmons arguably is a better fit. Because when I thought about the former roster construction for Brooklyn, I really didn't understand how they were supposed to match up with the better wings in the Eastern Conference, what in the world they were supposed to do with Giannis, what they were supposed to do with Joel Embiid. They didn't have defensive matchups other than just hoping that guys miss shots or Kevin Durant could become the best defender in the league somehow. Now, obviously, defending bigs is still a massive issue, but getting Simmons as a Giannis matchup is about as good as you're going to do in terms of someone that has a decent chance of defending him. Because before, the Nets really needed all three of these guys, or at least two of them, to be playing at maximum offensive efficiency to have a real chance in any of these playoff series. And it worked for a round and a half last year. But once guys started to go down, they didn't have their full complement of players. They didn't have a plan B. It was outscore everyone, hit more mid-range shots, hit more threes, and that was it. Now they have somewhat of a plan B. It's going to be a huge shakeup to their roster, something they're going to have to adjust to as the weeks and months go on here as we get towards the postseason. But I don't think you can really argue that the fit is better now. And really, that's where I've landed on this trade for both teams. I really think they both did an awesome job of getting out of the deal what they needed to, getting it done in a timely manner at this deadline, because there were huge negatives for both of them if this trade didn't go through. And I think ultimately that's what pushed it through, is the Nets knew that if they brought Harden back to the team with all these crazy reports, it was possible that he was just going to punt on the season and not really pay a ton of attention, not be active and engaged. And for a team that, when healthy, has a legitimate shot to win a title, that's just not something that you can be willing to deal with, especially when the possibility exists of getting someone back like Simmons. Whereas for Philly, if you go past this deadline without getting anything in exchange for Simmons, you're potentially wasting an entire awesome, potentially MVP level Joel Embiid season, as we've talked about in previous videos. Rounding out the conversation around the Nets, I think Curry is a really interesting and integral addition. I think he was always going to be part of the package because you don't really know what's going to happen with Joe Harris the rest of this year. It's unclear whether he's going to be able to return to the team, and just getting more spacing out of this certainly helps the team. I don't know if Drummond's going to be a starting big or someone they're going to run out there with second units, but they did need big depth. Drummond provides that. And then the 2 first-round picks as well. The Nets ended up not using these before the end of the deadline, electing to keep them potentially for some offseason moves. Maybe you can dump some salary with them later on, but it at least does help them given the fact they gave away all of their other picks trying to get Harden in the first place a year ago. Okay, so now what? Well, primarily the concerns here are twofold for each team. One, if you're Philly, you have to make sure that Harden re-engages with this NBA season. He's been out of touch for the last week and a half. He came into the season potentially either injured and or out of shape. That's something you need to remedy. And then you need to figure out his fit within this roster. What does adding him do to Tyrese Maxey's role? What are the other wings you're going to be able to put out there? Is it Danny Green going to be the starting wing now alongside Harris, Embiid, Maxey, and James Harden? What's the roster construction look like? You managed to keep Matisse Thybulle, but you need a lot of spacing on the floor around Harden and Embiid. I think their roster construction from a starting lineup standpoint is a little bit more unclear than Brooklyn's. But for Brooklyn, you have to figure out where Ben Simmons is at. You have to figure out if he's going to be ready to play. You have to figure out where he's at mentally. He's been away from basketball for a long time. It's going to take a little bit of time to not only integrate him into the team, but to get him back on the floor in the first place. The other pieces are certainly going to help. I'm excited to see Seth Curry in this offense. If Joe Harris does return, those two guys are going to provide a ton of spacing to this team. And the beginning and end game lineups, assuming they bring everybody back and everybody's healthy, are really, really intriguing. Because if you're Brooklyn, you can look at this and say, well, we've got Ben Simmons, who, if active and engaged, is an awesome defender. Kevin Durant has shown to be a really good defender as well. You put those two guys out there with shooting, with Kyrie, with Seth Curry, with Joe Harris, you can maintain a lot of the offensive firepower you had when you had Harden and more defense out of Simmons, and you can mitigate some of the spacing issues that Simmons provides better than what Philadelphia was able to. Now, circling back to Philadelphia, they are, as I said, they're better today than they were yesterday. Simply by getting any kind of value out of Simmons, they have improved their team dramatically for this season as well as into the next couple of years. It was clear that Morey and Harden have a connection. Obviously, from their time in Houston, there's other connections to Harden within the Philadelphia organization, and they could have gotten him this offseason. They potentially still would have had to trade stuff for him in a sign and trade or dump a ton of other pieces to sign him outright at a huge financial loss to Harden. Their most realistic path to acquiring him, in my opinion, was always making this move today. And now it comes down to, can you make Harden and Embiid work together? Embiid's never played with a perimeter creator on the level of Harden. Can you find a way to make him active and engaged and make him defend? And then this offseason, you have to deal with the free agency aspect of what his asking price is going to be. It's going to be a huge max. It's something you're going to have to commit to moving forward long into the future. But the bottom line is both of these teams, in my opinion, improved their standing within the league in terms of championship contention, in terms of top tier ceiling in a dramatic way as a result of this trade. I think it's hugely beneficial to both teams, and it's one that needed to happen. I give the Nets credit for recognizing the situation they were in and being active in moving Harden today. And I give the Sixers credit for waiting all this time to get maximum value out of Ben Simmons. And now all we can do is hope that these two teams play each other in the playoffs. Can you imagine Ben Simmons in a postseason game playing on the road in Philadelphia in front of those fans against Embiid, Harden playing against Kyrie and Kevin Durant? I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it right now. That series would be out of control. It's really something that we can only hope for at this point.